All right, well, welcome. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone here today for what is the inaugural debate in the Dean's Debate Series here at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. My name is Lincoln Davies. I have the privilege and honor of serving as the co-director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land, Resources, and Environment here at the college. And it's just my delight to welcome you all to this debate. What I'm going to do first is just introduce the debate and our speakers. I'm going to give you a little bit of context about this event. I'll introduce them and then we'll get started. So, this event, as I mentioned, is part of the Dean's Debate Series, which is designed to increase civil dialogue and discourse across difference on important issues of our day. And today we'll be talking about nuclear energy, which is, as you've all seen in the news, increasingly and in many different ways. I'm delighted to welcome to the debate today our two speakers, Stewart Forbes, who is counsel at Hogan Lovells in Washington, D.C., and Lexi Tudenham, who is the executive director of Hill, Utah, here in our home state. So let me just say a few words about the debate. Obviously, nuclear energy, like all energy resources, has trade-offs, really keen trade-offs. And it's a resource that has changed, I think, in the public perception over time and is getting particular attention in this current milieu of our world in which AI and data centers are really growing demand for electricity in a way we haven't seen in the past. So it's a particularly timely issue. It's a timely issue for Utah as Utah looks at different ways in which nuclear energy might play a mix in our energy production and energy consumption. Um, what we're going to do in terms of the format of this debate is in just a moment, I'm going to introduce the proposition. And then once I do that, Mr. Forbes will have the honor of addressing the affirmative of the proposition. He'll have about 15 minutes to do so. And then Ms. Tudenham will have about 15 minutes to respond to him. And then Mr. Forbes will have about 3 minutes for a rebuttal. Following that, I will moderate questions and answers from the audience. So you can use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to put in questions. I will also perhaps ask a few questions of my own, and our debaters are aware that might happen. So without further ado, let us get going. As I mentioned, Mr. Forbes is counsel at Hogan Lovells. He previously served in the Department of Energy in the federal government, um, in particular working on nuclear programs in both Republican and Democratic administrations. And Ms. Tudenham is, as I mentioned, the executive director of Heal Utah, which is an advocacy group here in our state. She has deep experience on environmental and energy issues and has worked as well with other NGOs across the country and has lived internationally and in Alaska. So without further ado, then, let me introduce the proposition. The proposition we'll be debating today is as follows. The percentage or proportion of energy produced by the United States from nuclear power should increase. Mr. Forbes, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Lincoln. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's a true pleasure to be here with everyone. The proposition that nuclear energy, as a proportion of the total energy, should increase argues in favor of an expansion of the electricity grid as a whole. We are experiencing an interesting moment, a kind of intersection of policy and market that is driving political decisions to look out across the energy spectrum, across transmission and distribution as the three prongs of energy, to build out new assets, new capacity that previously, at least in the last 20 to 40 years, we have not engaged as a country. This is being driven largely because of data center growth, expansion, increased electrification, as well as to a certain degree, and certainly our political colleagues would hope that this would happen, an increase in reshoring of US manufacturing. All of this is driving demand. We see this daily in our electricity bills. I'm here in DC, and I can tell you data center construction and electricity consumption is driving up my bill on a daily basis. So why nuclear then? Well, the traffic that you're seeing in the press says that the push for nuclear is new. that the interest and the money going into it is new, that this is a phenomenon perhaps tied to the second Trump administration, perhaps tied just to the advent of AI. However, it's something that if you actually dig into the numbers, this is a momentum that has been accelerating really over the past 2 decades. As Lincoln mentioned, I started my federal career under the Obama administration. And at that time, there was still support amongst the Democratic administration for expansion of nuclear. We saw this for the Utah residents. This comes close to home because this was the time when we began as the federal government to support the NuScale project, the partnership with the Utah Associated Municipal Power System at the Idaho National Laboratory, in addition to other development projects across the country, to try to get nuclear as a baseload power system onto the grid and to bring about a new age of production. Now, there were a variety of reasons at that time, but we'll get into in a second. But what happened after the transition to the Trump administration, the first Trump administration within government, was that the support continued. Unlike what has happened with other energy sources from Biden to Trump, nuclear from Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump has been consistently supported. Why? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with what nuclear offers. It is a costly form of electricity to build, undeniably. If you look at the numbers for the Vogtle 3 and 4 plant, they were billions of dollars over budget, years in delay. Certainly. The ROI, the return on investment or return on equity for utilities of nuclear takes decades, which is part of why they don't get built on a regular basis. But the desirability of them comes from their attributes. Nuclear generation is 24/7 generally. It produces, usually, at least the plants that we have in operation now, about 90% of what the plant advertised capacity is. So a gigawatt plant, a 1,000 megawatt plant, typically will produce around 900 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts, versus other power generation, which doesn't really come close to that type of capacity. So that on one side of the political aisle is very appealing. This provides baseload power for data centers, uninterruptible, generally. Transmission and distribution may tell us otherwise, as Lexi can probably attest. But it is a constant source of electrons for the grid. Now, from a different political vantage point, nuclear power plants tend to be built in remote areas, rural areas with not a lot of manufacturing infrastructure and capacity. These are high-paying jobs. And especially the way the existing nuclear fleet, which is the way the industry describes it, was deployed. These are jobs that an individual could go into the US Navy, come out of the Navy as a qualified nuclear engineer, and land in a six-figure salary in rural Alabama or rural upstate New York. It allows for good union jobs. It allows for economic investment in the community. This is all true, and the numbers do back it up. On the energy density for nuclear is tremendous. A pound of nuclear fuel, of uranium fuel, produces more terawatts than thousands of gallons, millions of gallons of petroleum. It just does. And then as compared to solar or wind, the difference is night and day. And that there's no pun intended on that. There is built within this, there is certainly the radioactive waste is an issue, and we'll talk about that as we go through. But the volume per terawatt hour is significantly lower of waste than other forms of energy. And it's manageable. It is solid. It's accountable. Unlike our fossil fuel emitting production sources, you see it. You see spent nuclear fuel. You know it. You have to manage it. It is not an externality that can be dumped into the commons and that can be then the rest of all of us citizens would then have to deal with, which is what we're seeing in other forms, specifically in hydrocarbon space of pollution and what's going on. So it is a non-emitting form of energy production. It is a national security priority The US evolved this technology. It came out of a war effort, admittedly, but it was the cutting edge of science where across the world, scientists came to the US, built out a capacity that humanity had never seen before. And so it is on the cutting edge of science and engineering. And from a vantage point, if we don't invest in it, from a national security vantage point, if we don't invest in it, we cede our global dominance to a large degree. And really, what we're seeing right now within the marketplace is that abundant energy is necessary. Now, we can talk, and we should as a society, and I think this is probably a different debate, talk about do the do the justifications of AI and big data really do the outcomes of them, do the results of them, do we need them? That's a different question. Assuming that we do, how do we get power to them? So nuclear energy does provide all of this. Now, what's interesting, and this is really what has shifted in the marketplace, is that nuclear energy now has new use functions. Before, you saw gigawatt scale, massive buildings, massive infrastructure. And if you go down to a nuclear power plant, some of the older ones, or even the new AP 1000s in Georgia, Vogel's Unit 3 and 4, they're huge capital investment. We have, or capital projects. We have now gotten to a situation where with new designs, you have smaller designs, smaller footprints, smaller risk of incident because of the nature of the source term, the passive safety features that are designed into them that can be used in different applications. There are designers working as we speak on mobile nuclear reactors that can be deployed into emergency zones. So a hurricane wipes out Puerto Rican generation where you can't get fossil fuel, natural gas to a generating plant at some place. You bring in a nuclear reactor that's portable, that's scalable to meet the need of that moment. That's a great use case. In the Gulf Coast, where we have so much hydrocarbon development and converting fossil fuels into plastic, everything from plastics to fertilizer, which we depend on. That process is energy intensive, thermal energy intensive. We now have nuclear designs where in the past, we would burn coal, natural gas, oil. You can use a nuclear reactor. Less waste to produce the products that we depend upon for modern life. In that case, this was recently docketed at the NRC. X Energy, one of the nation's designers, is working on this with Dow Chemical Company to build a nuclear reactor to replace fossil fuel. What does that do? Well, it lowers emissions. And from the vantage point when I was working in the Obama and Biden administration, this was one of the great selling points of nuclear. We had to get away from these emitting sources that are dumping tons of CO2 into the environment. Certainly, I think most people would agree with that proposition. But the other thing that has to be acknowledged is that the grid itself is a public good. We pay our utilities for the privilege of having the electricity we need to survive in modern life. We know this. But it is something where when a facility is added to the mix, if it has a direct negative impact on you, me, my grandmother, there's going to be consequences. And this is one of the things that has held nuclear back for years. Now, we are for the first time seeing, I mentioned at the outset that there was political support for this and has been for my entire career in this space. Now we're seeing market conditions change. So whereas before the grid operated and you had fully depreciated assets producing electricity, your power rates were pretty steady for all of us. We knew what was going on. Demand for electricity was flat and had been flat if you look at the numbers for years. All of a sudden, the demand of electricity is spiked. So why? Well, we know this. This is hyperscalers. This is data centers. This is AI. What has happened, though, is in part of the market is that these entities are now seeing, and we're seeing this in the trade with the regional transmission organizations, with the public utility commissions, that while these entities need power, It is unfair to pass that burden on to grandma. Okay, that makes sense. And so what has happened is these entities are now entering into the market to pay for nuclear development because they want the attributes of nuclear. They want the 24/7, they want the reliability, they want the high energy density, and for newer reactors, the smaller footprint than the gigawatt scale reactors of the AP1000. All of that is going on. Now, it has not filtered into the marketplace, and we will talk about this more, I'm sure, but it is starting to. You're seeing sleeved power purchase agreements between developers going to nuclear companies who are working with utilities to build these assets. This is underwriting some of the costs that would normally be spread across rate base, which is what we don't want to have happen. You do not want, nobody wants, $1 billion combined cycle natural gas plant to be built and drive up your rates 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That's an extreme example. Nor do you want a nuclear power plant that would do more to your bills. So this is a very unique moment, and nuclear represents something, that is unique. It represents the possibility to take offline assets like coal, assets like natural gas, certainly petroleum, that we need to replace. And in the West, where we have years of hydro development, but hydro is no longer viable potentially because of drought, because of low snowpack. Nuclear, if used on a non-light water system, of which there are several designs, or nuclear that uses, like the Palo Verde plant in Arizona, uses reprocessed, reclaimed, recovered gray water, you have a possibility to have something that is scoped and designed to meet the electricity needs that you have in your community. Now, I don't think you will see AP1000 style plants, massive plants built in the middle of the Utah desert. There's not enough water, I'm sorry to say. But there are options that exist. Now, what do we do with spent nuclear fuel? I'm sure Lexi's going to bring this up in a bit. The problems that we see, and this is what I'll conclude with, oftentimes with nuclear deployment, there was a market problem for years. The market problem is working itself out, as I said. The waste problem, the siting problem, the interconnection problem, those are engineering issues that we have solutions to, but for which we don't seem to have the political will to put them into practice. So there are things that can be done. And right now, this is an exciting time because for the first time in my career, I have never seen so much interest. These are not the same 5 companies that I've talked to for a decade. We now have dozens of entrants into the place. Not all of them serious. Most of them, though, do have good ideas, do have good designs, good use cases. And it's a moment that is very unique in the opportunity that presents to provide power that really we need at the base of our electrical grid. So without further ado, I'll turn my time over to Lexi.
Thank you so much, Stuart, and thank you to the Stegner Forum as well as Lincoln, of course, for inviting me. It's a true honor to be here. I'm really excited. I don't take part in a lot of debates, and so as mentioned, I am the executive director of the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah, Hill, Utah, and so just to set the baseline here, I do agree with Stuart that we are at a moment in which energy demand is soaring, and there has been a resurgence of interest in nuclear energy. Where I differ, I think, is in what that moment means and what it dictates for us. The last nuclear renaissance was about 20 years ago now, early in the Obama administration. It didn't pan out then, and it is unlikely to save us now because we are facing 2 urgent challenges at once. So there's a climate crisis that demands rapid action, and we have a growing and perhaps skyrocketing need for affordable, reliable energy. Nuclear energy is often presented as the answer to both, but expanding nuclear energy is not practical, equitable, or an effective climate solution. It's slow, costly to deploy, dependent on public subsidy, and imposes long-term public health, safety, and environmental risks from uranium mining all the way through to radioactive waste disposal. Proliferation risks must also be taken seriously in our current era of global insecurity. And nuclear energy creates ongoing burdens and significant hidden costs while diverting resources from faster, safer, and more affordable clean energy options. So, what I'm going to start with here is just putting forth a series of questions that we need to be asking about nuclear energy, regardless of whether we think it is the right path forward or not. I'll see if I get to answering all of them. If not, ask me questions at the end. So, first and foremost, is nuclear energy an effective solution for climate change? When will nuclear power plants come online, new ones that is? Who will they serve? And what energy sources will be used until then? How much will nuclear power cost and who will pay for it? Broadly, who will benefit from nuclear power and who will bear the burdens it creates, financial, environmental, and public health wise? How and where will radioactive nuclear waste be stored? And then how safe is nuclear power? What security risks does it pose? How will public and impacted communities be involved in decision making? And finally, what alternatives could we be relying on instead? So let's start with the most important one here. So, is nuclear power really an effective solution for climate change? And I know that we're talking about the expansion here. So we are at a moment indeed, but that moment dictates that we take really rapid, decisive action on decarbonization in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change and to stave off the tipping points and feedback loops that will result in ever more drastic consequences for our world and our people. Climate change is now, AI is now, but new nuclear power is not now. The next 5 to 10 years are absolutely critical in our fight against climate change, but nuclear plants are not going to be able to deliver energy transition we need on that time scale. They typically take 10 to 15 to 20 years or more to build and are often delayed. There's never been a nuclear power plant worldwide that has been built in less than 10 years from planning to operations. And that's not just in the US, we're actually worse. As Stewart mentioned, the last plant that was built in the US, the Vogtle 3 and 4 reactors, took 17 and 18 years from planning to operations, respectively. New solar and wind, for comparison, typically take 1 to 3 years to build. And new reactors, first of their kind or not, suffer from delays, whether that's due to a lack of fuel, like we're seeing for the TerraPower reactor, or due to a simple lack of delivery, like the NuScale small modular reactor project, which was projected to be 10 years out in 2015, was still 10 years out in 2020, and finally collapsed in 2023. So the reason that this matters, besides jobs, economic development, and reliable power promised to communities who are let down over and over when the industry overpromises and underdelivers, is that in the interim, we are continuing to burn vast amounts of fossil fuels. We have seen this with our data centers, where hyperscalers like Google and Meta claim they're going to run their data centers on nuclear power. They make these power purchase agreements, but then in the interim, they're building gas plants, or in some cases, even extending the life of coal plants. There is a true opportunity cost for counting on nuclear that is being paid in billions of tons of carbon while we wait for new nuclear plants to come online. Every year and every dollar spent on nuclear is a dollar and a year not spent on solutions we can deploy now, which include grid upgrades, solar, wind, battery storage. And if we're serious about reducing emissions quickly, we need technologies that can scale rapidly. So on to cost. Stewart talked about this bunch, but in our US energy system, we need about 25 to 30% dispatchable power. I think baseload gets overused because it's actually a limitation rather than an asset. Baseload tends to mean that we cannot be flexible, we cannot load follow. And so when we are running the most expensive source of power 24/7, that means that in some cases we're not able to take advantage of more competitive costs in various other energy sources. So that 25 to 30% can be provided really by any firm dispatchable source, probably a lot of them. Historically, it's been coal. Now it's going to be an economic competition to see what source can fit this need at the lowest cost. And to my mind, it's very unlikely that nuclear power will be able to fit that description. In 2025, we hit another world record for amount of wind and solar built, 814 gigawatts, most of that in China. During that time, the best data source I could find was that there were about 29 gigs of additional nuclear slated to come online between 24 and 26. Yes, I know we're at the beginning of this renaissance, but as long as we continue to build out transmission, the other 70% there can be supplied by intermittent sources like wind and solar, which also happen to be the most cost-effective energy sources on market. So that's 3 to 8 times less expensive than nuclear power, even if you consider capacity factors. Those same Vogtle reactors were some of the most expensive power projects in history. So put another way, we often see negative learning costs in the nuclear industry, where we've seen costs go up 49% since 2009, while at the same time, solar costs have gone down by 83% and wind costs have gone down by 65%. And cost matters. Cost matters more than energy density, actually. It's energy density tends to be the wrong optimization. Not just because when we rely on the most expensive energy source for power, even if we have some cushioning from hyperscalers, we're still burdening ratepayers and families potentially who are dealing with an ever-increasing cost of living. And if we don't factor in costs, we won't make the right decisions and we won't end up with abundant energy. You can get a lot more energy if you take your $10 billion and put it into wind and solar with battery backup than if you put it into nuclear. Currently, nuclear also remains deeply dependent on government support through subsidies, loan guarantees, as well as this mind-bending management of materials that remain harmful for hundreds of thousands of years. So that all means that US taxpayers will fit the bill, and the public, not the industry, bears the major cost of managing radioactive waste for generations. It's a system where, unfortunately, profits are privatized and risks and costs are still socialized. So I'm going to take a moment and just sort of divert to small modular reactors because I think there's a lot of interest here. First off, they're not a new idea. They're being repackaged and remarketed for our current era. The primary reason they have not prevailed in the past is because economies of scale have always dictated a trend towards larger scale reactors. If you're going to pay for a very high capital cost reactor, you need to be getting a lot of energy out of it. So per kilowatt cost for the NuScale SMR project was even higher than for Vogtle before a single shovel had hit the ground. So even if you assume that we can get the cost down, you need 10,000 iterations of the exact same reactor to get to about a half cost reduction. And in order to get down to a third, where it might start to be cost competitive, you need 1 million iterations. So by my last count, there are about 127 different SMR designs in front of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so standardization, modularity, factory production, and these other touted cost savings are nowhere in sight right now. The idea of small or micro reactors deployed with limitless power and all sorts of applications is really exciting. But for that dream to become a reality, the cost and complexity would have to come down by orders of magnitude. Right now, you can do that, but it's with a solar panel and battery backup. And when you export that technology, you are not increasing the likelihood of more state and non-state actors with nuclear weapons capability. So what if we can get the cost down? What if we are actually able to bring commercial scale power plants online and timelines that are being projected? That's a big if, but let's talk about health, safety, and benefits versus burdens. So you've heard a bit about the benefits, but historically, we have not done a good job of clear public process, transparent decision-making, clear-eyed evaluation of risks, or taking care of our mining and working communities. Ask any downwinder here in Utah. But this also hits home here because on the Navajo Nation alone, we have over 500 abandoned uranium mines, and community members continue to raise concerns about the impacts of the White Mesa Mill. At every stage of the nuclear fuel chain, radioactive materials are produced that create hazards for humans. Mining and processing expose workers and nearby communities. Nuclear plants release small amounts of radiation even during normal operation, and accidents and leaks, while rare, have severe consequences. We also see transport of radioactive materials, introducing additional risks. Think about Ohio, train derailments, and so on and so forth. Also, as we've talked about, we have no permanent repository for nuclear waste in this country. And that means that high-level waste will be stored on-site where it was produced, which will eventually, if it's not already, near farms, near schools, near water sources, and communities. Radiation exposure is cumulative. It is linked to increased cancer risk and a lot of other health impacts, but those risks are not evenly distributed. They fall disproportionately on certain communities. So we see serious equity concerns with nuclear. Indigenous communities have borne the brunt of the uranium mining. Rural and lower income communities are more likely to be targeted for waste storage. We've seen this in Utah with the Goshute Nation. And there's also a question of generational equity, where future generations inherit this responsibility of managing hazardous materials they did not create. One of the most difficult things to quantify with respect to civilian nuclear energy has been morbidity and mortality. Death estimates from incidents like Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and the Church Rock spill, which was actually the largest accidental release of radioactive material to ever occur on US soil, are wildly inaccurate because of the long latency of cancer and genetic effects associated with exposure. So what we need to look at is large-scale epidemiological evidence. A couple of recent studies did highlight the risks associated with even low level exposure to ionizing radiation from nuclear power plants within current regulatory dose limits. A 2024 meta-analysis spanned 480,000 workers, 7.5 million residents, and it showed significantly higher risks of cancer and leukemia in residents near nuclear power plants, with the greatest increased risk of cancer for children under 5. What this demonstrates is actually the insufficiency of our current radiation standards, which have historically underestimated impacts and biological differences in women and children because they used as their basis a reference man. Finally, this moment for the nuclear industry is really happening at a time when it is clear that human and environmental health, transparency, and decision making are not top federal priorities. Changes initiated at the DOE without public process and executive orders seeking to loosen radiation rules and accelerate progress are deeply concerning and could have really profound consequences for the safety of those same workers who have those jobs, as well as communities. Pro-nuclear advocates and industry professionals have come out to express their concern about the revision of standards and the loss of independence by regulatories like the NRC. I do need to take a moment to pause on nuclear security and safety. I think one of the most important things to remember is that we are truly in a uniquely insecure moment in global history. The post-World War II order is very likely crumbling. What we see in front of us is a world where nuclear threats must once more be taken very seriously. Nuclear weapons experts have pointed out that in our current war with Iran, we are very focused on the enriched uranium, but the substantial reserve of spent nuclear fuel is actually going to provide a very viable direct path to production of a plutonium bomb. And looking back, the foundation of Iran's program was through the Eisenhower Atoms for Peace program, a world in which SMR or US-based SMR technologies deployed and shared worldwide actually makes for a substantially less secure world. The concept of advanced nuclear safeguards and meltdown-proof walkaway safe reactors, as well as the potential for safely reprocessing spent fuel, are unfortunately and massively oversold, whether it's the potential for sodium fires with an atrium reactor or the physical impossibility of reprocessing price of fuel. No one reactor design solves all the intractable problems that it faces. Streamlining of permitting, even if it were in the pursuit of power to serve the people, rather than to enrich hyperscalers, will never be a net good if we create another generation of downwinders along the way. Here in Utah, we've been considered expendable before. Our native populations are rural residents, our deserts. And so bipartisan support for nuclear power is growing. But here on the ground in Utah, I can also tell you that opposition and concern does not fall along party lines. Yes, air pollution due to burning fossil fuels leads to millions of premature deaths around the world each year, and even more millions impacted by climate change. But to compare those impacts with suffering from radiation is a false dichotomy. Our choices are not nuclear or coal, or radioactive waste or climate change. It's not even about abundant energy or asceticism. We don't live in a fantasy world. Everything has a cost. That's going to include mining and other impacts for renewable generation batteries. But climate change is here and it's now. So the good news is that we do have better options. We can make the choice here for our future where available renewable technology is rapidly and meaningfully deployed along demand side management, transmission build out, grid improvements, even as up and coming technologies like enhanced geothermal come into play without the risk of proliferation, meltdown, and radiation that will last for millennia. Or we can wait around for another 20 years for nuclear to deliver on its promises. Thank you.
Okay, so we've now been able to hear from both the affirmative and the negative sides of the proposition. Mr. Forbes, as the proponent of the proposition, will have 3 minutes for rebuttal.
So much. It's very interesting in this type of dialogue because there's a lot with which I agree with Lexi and a fair amount that I disagree. So let's hit some of the agreements because I think that's going to develop a more constructive conversation for us generally. She's right. Nuclear will not and cannot meet the 18-month timeline of development that is needed right now if supporting AI development and data center development is actually a public good that we want to do. It can't. Neither can coal. Neither can natural gas. The reality is the entire system is strapped for power, and we need better transmission distribution. We need high conductivity lines. We need to replace those. But from production's perspective, solar gets there faster with battery backup. That's true. And with the issues in the supply chain on nuclear, it is not a 5-year solution, but it may be an 8 to 15-year solution. And this is where the industry is very interesting right now. Because if you look at turbine shortages for natural gas and for other fossil fuel-based production, those timelines, which historically have been very disconnected, where nuclear deployment was a 15-year proposition and gas was a 3-year, they're coming very much closer together now. And natural gas is not going away as an energy source, and certainly this administration seems bent on keeping coal as part of our base. Well, nuclear, if we're looking at new construction, does pose the possibility of replacing those types of energy in a non-emitting way. Now, Lexi talked a little bit about the legacy and the pollution aspects of it. One of the things that one of its hallmarks, and one of it I think is actually a benefit to it, is the fact that, as I said earlier, we know what the risk is. We know what the fuel waste is. If you look at the entire life cycle of every energy production source, they're all dirty. We know this. Batteries require mining of minerals in Congo, in Indonesia. They require shipment on fossil fuel powered diesel barges to China for refinement, shipment to the US for manufacturing. It is a dirty process. Solar requires plastics and rare earths materials. And then on the back end, after its 10 to 20-year lifespan, it gets scrapped. It's a little bit unknown. There are externalities that generation utilities have dumped onto us as part of the commons. In law, we call it the tragedy of the commons that we're all bearing. Nuclear is a little bit unique because we know what the waste is, and it doesn't emit. Now, I would disagree with the risks with some of the epidemiology. I think historically, if you were to balance it, deaths per kilowatt hour, which is a terrible metric, are probably lower in nuclear than in other sources. But this is the type of conversation. The conversation can't be simply radiation bad, solar good. It has to be what over the whole lifespan of this, where is the balance and where can we come? And nuclear, I think, has a good argument to say it is clean, it is safe. And Lincoln's online, so I'm going to stop talking. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you both so much. I think we have an incredible amount to chew on here. Let me just remind our audience that we will entertain questions from you all. My plan is to propose the questions to both of the speakers, given this is a debate format, so they can both respond. So please use your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you would like to pose questions, and I'll be moderating those. With that, let me pose one question. I'll start with you, Stewart, and then we'll let Lexi take a chance to respond if she'd like. So one of the things that Lexi noted, and I think you acknowledged in your remarks, was that there isn't really a permanent solution to long-term storage of nuclear waste. We currently have tried a bunch of things in the United States. Yucca Mountain has been ping-ponged back and forth from one presidential administration to the next. And the waste currently is sitting just on reactor sites in a way that was never planned. So given that problem, how would you respond that nonetheless we should move forward?
No, it's a valid question. And my frank assessment is that Yucca will never, as long as Nevada is a swing state, Yucca will never happen. I mean, that's electoral politics at their worst, perhaps, or at their best, depending on your vantage point. What I will say is if you look at the fuel storage, the casks in which the solid fuel is stored, they're relatively safe. We have not had issues of proliferation, of sabotage. They're protected. We have not really, at least to my knowledge, and maybe there's data that I'm not aware of, had leaks into water supply. Yes, they need to be managed for tens of thousands of years, undoubtedly. But volumetrically, it's a fairly small quantity of material relative to the metric tons of CO2 that go into the atmosphere, the size of wind turbine blades, which we can't recycle, by the way, generally. So, yeah, it is a problem, but it is something that has historically proven to be, because it's not causing immediate harm, it's something that the utilities and the government tends to be okay with. Now, when you're dealing with some of these novel fuel forms in the advanced reactor world, I will 100% agree, and I think Lexi's probably going to start there, that there are issues there because our casks are proven for solid fuel of generation 2 and generation 3 reactors. For these novel forms, it's kind of unproven, and we don't necessarily have all the data we need. But I think it's an engineering challenge, and it's one that we can manage. It would be better if we had a national solution, but given our electoral politics, I think right now the regional solution is where we sit, and we'll probably sit for a while.
All right, Lexi, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I just like to add that. I think that yes, it's an engineering challenge, but it's also a social challenge. Um, Historically, where those wastes have sat and are going to sit in the long term, it frequently the siting gets routed to low income communities. It gets routed to people without a lot of other options. Listening to, for example, the DOE consent based siting process from a couple years ago, it was described as a reverse auction. And I will certainly acknowledge that there are communities that are going to be comfortable with that think that is their best economic option. I think what needs to happen there is a lot of informed consent and a really, really sustained push to ensure that people understand what they are taking on and that they are actually accruing benefits from it. What you see from these radiologic risks is, yes, we have these casks. They weren't necessarily built for hundreds of thousands of years, not to mention millennia. I don't really know how we build for that. And you do see deep geologic repositories built in places like Finland, where you have the Onkalo, which stores about 6,500 tons of waste at a cost of quite a few $1 billion. We have 90,000 tons of waste right now in the US. This is not with new generation. So we would need a whole lot of oncolos, and they're going to cost a lot of money. We're not going to have appropriate sites everywhere. Certainly, when we hear here in Utah that we should be storing this in salt caverns, for example, we know that this project has been tried in New Mexico, and there have been quite a few explosions associated with it. We know that our state also has recently, in its RFI for the Nuclear Innovation Campus, expressed its very strong intent to actually pursue a permanent repository in state. I think as people who live here, that is right here. That's not in someone else's backyard. That's in our backyard. And I think therefore there needs to be an outsized voice from the public and from the communities where those things will be cited. That also has the opportunity to have a say in what they are going to get out of it, if so.
Okay, Lexi, let me come back at you with another question. I'm going to sort of flip the roles here. One thing that has been true, I think, historically, and Stewart's own experience is sort of an exhibit of this, is that Republican and Democrats tend to support nuclear power nowadays. And most public polling figures show that there's pretty wide support for nuclear energy. So, given that, how do you feel comfortable pushing back on that in Utah?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things, as I said, is that when we have seen support at the national level, much of that has been increasingly bipartisan. I will say it's growing. And I think part of that is um, a lack of recent memory of Cold War issues. Um, you know, uh, while I do think that the civilian nuclear industry is distinct from the weapons industry, even Stewart sort of drew that comparison of there is a security issue here where there is equivalency and a lot of exchange between both the energy industry and the weapons industry. And I think to a previous point, there have been quite a few thefts of enriched fuel. I took a course through the Non-Proliferation Center last year where we spoke with a lot of military experts, and I think a lot of those aren't publicly disclosed, but there have been many more shipments of enriched uranium that have gone missing than I think we are aware of as the general public. Here in Utah, I think that um, bipartisan or not, people need to have their valid concerns addressed. I will say I've had a lot of trouble with the state effort to basically run a PR campaign to convince people of the viability and importance and safety of nuclear fuel when that really has been a top-down education effort where it's not about engagement. It's not necessarily about listening. There is a predetermined outcome where the state wants to pursue this, and so therefore it's trying to set the stage for it. People who we've talked to in communities where these projects are being proposed, many of them have not been consulted. I will say, for example, people in Tooele, where there was a resolution that came out of town council. Many residents did not know about that, and they did not actually support it. And I understand that we're never going to have a monolith of support or opposition in any one place. And so you need to be, therefore, having even better public engagement. And we have not seen that so far. I think the methodology, even that has been rolled out in this current public, I guess, opinion survey for in-state at least, is pretty flawed and has involved some fairly problematic ways of coaching people on their answers. And so we need to be honest, and we need to not just pat communities on the head and say, hey, listen, you don't understand the new technologies. This is much safer. This is a completely different beast than you've heard about in the past. I will say up at the legislature all the time, we get told, well, this is not the Simpsons. And thank you. We're well aware of that. I think there's a place to have valid concerns without being dismissive about them.
Okay, I'm going to, Stuart, if you want to briefly respond, you may, but then I'm going to start sort of peppering you both in a sort of more rapid fire fashion. We've got a lot of questions coming in the Q&A.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad there's a lot of questions. No, I would just say, I think one thing that is helpful, and I've been at this long enough to know a lot of legacy impressions tend to color our takes today. And even comparing downwinders, which was a tragedy and it should never have happened, that's tied to weapons testing. It was, and not to reactor operations. Like using language like that, I do think, and those historical things, while they're informative and they can't be ignored or forgotten, it's not an apples to apples of what the current proposal is. So I do think that there's some need for us to find a common language with a common understanding. This is in the philosophy of science, this is a problem of paradigms where we use the same words, but we talk past each other because they have different meanings. This has become a problem. I mean, this is a huge problem politically. This is why we're having this conversation and debate right now. But I think in the nuclear, both from proponents and opposition, finding those baselines is important for us because without them, we're never going to actually get to the truth of what is the risk and what is the reward for this activity.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you both of you, a couple questions from the audience and just see if it challenges your proposition. I'm going to ask you to say yes or no, and then give me one or two sentences why or why not. So one question that came in for you, Stuart, is if you take into account the cost of casks for storage over time, just assuming that everything sort of stays the same in terms of how everything operates, those casks are built to last about 80 years. Most surveys show, or most science shows, that nuclear waste will last at least 100,000 years, if not longer. So doesn't that change the evaluation here? Yes or no?
I would say probably it wouldn't change my opinion on the benefits of nuclear, but it would change the calculus of the cost. Yes.
Okay. So Lexi, for you, one thing that has been being worked on for some time, and a year or two ago, there was some pretty good progress at the Livermore lab on nuclear fusion. If nuclear fusion becomes an effective technology, does that change your position?
I think that's that would be lovely. It is a long way out. I know there are reactors being built in China. I mean, the breakthrough at Lawrence Livermore was that we finally, for once, produced a spark of energy that was ever so slightly more than what we put into it. We are a long way out, and the economic issues are going to continue to plague that for far longer even than fission.
I agree.
Okay, another question that's come in, I think, picks up on a point that Lexi made in her remarks, Stuart. So I'm going to give a question to you. Isn't the market telling us, with all the cost overruns, restarts, extensions, that there's not really an interest in nuclear, and so we should put our money in other resources like wind and solar?
I think that's a false equivalency, to be honest. Wind and solar have their place. I supported them while I was at DOE. They were part of my portfolio. I think nuclear serves a different niche in the marketplace, to be frank. And I think the market right now, what we're seeing with restarts of Dwayne Arnold, potentially completion of VC Summer, and even the newly renamed Three Mile Island Unit 1, there are market indicators that we need to have this technology and these assets on grid right now, for a variety of reasons.
Okay, another question came in. I'm going to give this one to you, Lexi. Yesterday, EIA published. EIA is the federal agency that does energy information and forecasting. They published their 2026 annual energy outlook, and it shows that nuclear penetration under most scenarios will fall to 12 and 15% by 2050. Given that, I know the proposition today is that whether we should support more nuclear coming on the system. Do you support the existing nuclear that's on the system right now remaining there?
I think let's let it die a natural death, right? A lot of it has already been extended beyond its originally planned lifespan. And I think there's a real question when we extend the life of nuclear plants. Yes, some of them, the capital cost has gone on. I think we have to really look at safety and see if the updates that are needed in order to keep those plants operating are worth it for the energy that we will get out of them. There's a risk component and there's also a cost component there. And I will also say on the other point that enhanced geothermal is also a great place to be investing and would serve a very similar and perhaps even better serve the niche than nuclear.
Okay, let me ask this question. A question came in about France and how they treat their nuclear waste. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A about waste. My understanding is that France largely reprocesses their waste. So I'll let Stuart respond first and then Lexi next. Should the U.S. change its policy and start reprocessing waste?
Nuclear waste reprocessing poses a variety of issues, plutonium extraction and weapons grade material extraction being probably top on most lists. But the reality is, from a financial perspective, your inputs, your costs to reprocessing low enriched uranium are huge. And you have legacy waste to handle for the reprocessing, and you get less uranium back than you would if you simply use mined fresh. That's the reality of reprocessing. Now, it's better when you're dealing with higher enrichment levels. If we could reprocess away our weapons, that would be, in an ideal, peaceful world, that could be good. Just because the density of uranium is higher in those types of materials. But unless and until we get into a more recycling culture, I think reprocessing of the current fleet's waste is unlikely to make any sense in the US market.
Yeah, I think I
Lexi?
would just second that. France's program is heavily subsidized. When we take an already expensive nuclear energy source and add in reprocessing costs, you have the reason we haven't done it. The primary one, beyond security, I will say. And I think it's a fantasy to think that that is going to solve our waste problems.
And we're bad at recycling all of our production waste. I mean, solar and wind aren't any better in this space.
Okay, so there's several questions about nuclear disasters in the Q&A. Obviously, Chernobyl, quite cataclysmic, and then Fukushima Daiichi just 15 years ago in Japan. Given the risk of those catastrophes, what does that mean for the future of nuclear? Briefly, Lexi and then Stuart.
Oh goodness. I mean, I think this is the fact, right? Where yes, on the global scale, disasters are relatively rare, but when they happen, they are catastrophic. And I think that, Stewart might disagree with me on sort of the epidemiology of the health consequences of those, but I think there's a lot that we don't necessarily know. And I will say that our existing nuclear fleet is particularly susceptible and vulnerable to extreme weather events because many of them are located along water sources. So when we have sea level change, when we have extreme weather, when we have flooding, those are the places that are going to be affected, even more so than certain conventional types of power plants.
Let's hope the Cascadia fault never gives. There's books on that. Yeah, Lexi knows what I'm talking about. I would say vis-a-vis Chernobyl specifically, that type of disaster simply can't happen with our fleet. That was a function of its design as a graphite water hybrid. We don't have that. We're not going to run a reactor in that way. That was a particularly terrible design and terrible test that the Soviet administration ran.
If I can just,
Fukushima Dai oh Fukushima Daiichi, I think, is a different problem, and this gets to what Lexi was touching on with regulators and the problem of losing regulatory control. That shouldn't have happened. You should have had a higher tidal wall. You should not have put the diesel backup generators in the basement. You should have known that you were in a 100-year tsunami zone. All these things were failures, and TEPCO has admitted to most of them. And part of the issue there was that the regulator was too close to the regulated utility, and so you didn't correct these problems before they happened. Also, don't close the vents when the power goes out because hydrogen builds up. It was not a nuclear explosion, just for the record. It was a hydrogen explosion. And that is a big deal when we override systems, and human error aggravated that in the extreme. Sorry.
no, so sorry to interrupt. I think the one thing wanted to add into that response was the other issue that we need to consider right now is that nuclear security also involves making sure that our civilian power plants are effectively protected from things like drone attacks. We've certainly seen in the Ukraine war that nuclear power plants are a target, with the potential for not only a total loss of power for the entire country, but also creating much wider destruction beyond that.
Okay, and with that, we're just about at time. What I wish we could do is continue this conversation. And the good news is we can continue this conversation. The next annual Stegner Symposium, which we hold every March, will be March 18th and 19th on the future of nuclear energy and its role in our society. So please mark those dates again, March 18th and 19th, 2027. We really very much hope to see you all there. In person or online as part of the symposium. It should be a stellar lineup and a really fascinating 2 days of exploring in depth this very thorny issue. So with that, let me thank Stewart Forbes and Lexi Tudenham for joining us as our debaters in this inaugural event in the Dean's Debate Series. Let me thank also behind the scenes our incredible group of event staff who have made this possible. And let me thank all of you for engaging with us at the Stegner Center. We look forward to seeing you in the coming months in our Greenback series and then the annual symposium next March. So thank you all and take care.